look at the budget studies put out by NREL, and then you look at the average pricing of solar, and NREL is saying the price of solar should be around $266 a watt, but actually the market is commanding closer to a $3 a watt premium, and that's directly related to the subsidy. That 30% federal tax credit to some extent allows you to front load your project cost by selecting the most expensive components, because why not? They're 30% off. That kind of front loading might not occur if we eliminated the federal tax credit, although until we start valuing the cost of dumping emissions into the atmosphere, then without that cost, we can't compete on an economically even playing field. One industry would say the tax credit is unfair because it imbalances the playing field. The solar industry would say the tax credit is fair because we're at an uneven footing, and that helps rebalance the value of renewable energy versus non-renewable energy. But regardless, NREL says, look, if you're paying costs for the material, and then you're paying typical profit, overhead, permitting, and supply chain, you should be around a $266 a watt project budget. Now, comparing NREL's pricing to what I see in the field, I think they're overstating their balance of system material, although I put a decent amount of thought into how to optimize balance of system material. Solar module costs are pretty good. I usually go for top shelf inverters, and I end up spending more money on my inverters. It could be that my vendors are smaller vendors that don't have the great pricing, but I don't see 15-cent a watt inverters. In fact, I often will recommend the most expensive inverter just because of me being familiar with the quality of those top shelf inverter companies. Racking, that's another one where, if I'm doing a racking system on a rooftop, I'm over-engineering it. The racking may call for 6-foot on-center attachments. I'm doing 4. This budget might not include the cost of flashing, but you always want to flash your L feet. So I kind of overkill the structural side, and so my racking, maybe my personal design philosophy is a little too expensive, but I think that the largest blind spot in the design process is the structural engineering. So I'll generally over-engineer it. Labor budgets. I recently asked a community of solar installers, does anyone do labor-only contracts where you pay for just the labor and the consumables? And I got a few responses from installers that are doing labor-only contracts at like 65 cents a watt, all the way up to $1 a watt. But in my opinion, when I do projects with new electrical contractors, if you have one guy on the crew who knows what they're doing, and the rest of the crew has electrical and general hand skills, I'll usually do the labor on a time and material basis, where it's like a 30% markup for any material provided, but we're only talking about small tools and consumables. And then and then they're billing their hourly rate. I've had I did a residential project recently in Wisconsin where I used 2 $75 an hour union electricians, and we were able to hit this budget. I used on a commercial budget for Half Moon, but it was only a 29 kilowatt array, a general contractor who provided a crew of 5 licensed electricians and a lift equipment, and that budget came in at 35 cents per watt. And so in other words, the solar labor, even under a labor-only contract, is at a pretty egregious markup. And there's real savings to be had by you spending more time on the design end to get your project ready for a general contractor. Structural engineering stamp, I like including it at least as an option because it makes you look more professional. If the other solar installer isn't doing anything with structural engineering, has 6-foot on center attachments, isn't reinforcing the corners or the edges of the array, may not be flashing their L feet, isn't abiding by the fire code access, versus you, and you might not have any solar experience at all, but you're checking all those boxes. You're doing the engineering, you're abiding by fire code. You're going to look more professional, and the solar contractor is going to look like they might be taking shortcuts in the design phase. If they're taking shortcuts in the design phase, what's going to happen when it gets out to the field and construction? The problem is we have not had a design phase in the solar industry. Not the federal tax credit, but the local incentives provided by the utility have encouraged specialty contractors to ramrod their projects through the rebate programs. And that means you get a lot of design work that goes on in the field during the installation when you have a rebate program budget to deal with in order to get an excessively generous subsidy. And the people left out of that are your traditional project planners who might have a year between the time the home is designed and the time the home is built. And also the thing is, when you get into larger and larger companies, you start seeing the overhead costs and the supply chain costs, or actually the overhead costs go up because you're looking at more of a sales rep kind of business model as opposed to kind of a word of mouth publicity. So when we calculate a simple payback, what you're going to do is you're going to look at the installed price of solar. You're going to back out the tax credit and then divide by your annual production. Or instead of having a total installed price, I just keep it per watt. So if you have an install price of $260 per watt, you back out the tax credit, you divide your annual golden ratio number from PV watts of 1.4 kilowatt hours per watt per year, and then your electric rate. And we can see in a place, like my hometown in Mississippi, this is kind of typical for the South. This is typical for Kansas City. The reason why it's less in Houston is Houston is so humid all year round that humidity, in addition to the heat, drags down the array performance. Let's go up to Minneapolis, Minnesota. Anyway, kind of getting off point. We're going back to our 412 roof pitch, and we're going to face due south up in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And actually at 1,322, you get as much production out of a solar array in Minneapolis as you do in Houston, Texas. And in fact, for the utility scale designers in the room, you go and you run the calculation with a tracking array rather than a fixed in place array. This is it for Minneapolis, 1,675. And we're talking about horizontal axis tracking. So 1,492 for a traditional horizontal axis tracker. We changed that location to Houston. So PV watts is tremendously fun to play around with. It's loading the weather station. It seems to be taking a while. I'm just going to refresh here. Yeah. So we go to Houston. We do a tracking array, single axis. 1,516. And so what we're seeing is all the way from the southern part of the United States all the way up to the north part of the United States, fairly uniform production. And it's much closer together than further apart. in other words. And a lot of this has to do with the atmosphere, the fact that you go further north and you get into cloudier winters, and you go further south and maybe you have less cloudy winters, but you have higher temperatures. So the losses due to the heat kind of balance out with the losses due to weather cycles. And what that means is that for most of the United States, with average production and average electric pricing, with where pricing should be at under general construction, you're looking at a 12-year payback. Now the thing is, I live in rural Mississippi, and most solar contractors, if you can find one out here, most of them are selling arrays $3 or $4 a watt, usually more like $4 in a rural area with no competition. And they find customers simply because the homeowner has deep pockets and a desire to own a solar array. They'd rather have a 15-year payback on a solar array than give a penny more to the utility than they have to. What this says is we really need to see install prices around $260 a watt with the federal tax credit and no local subsidy in order to see a payback that is even on the edge of being reasonable. So it is important to control your cost all the way through, especially when you're outside higher priced electricity markets like being off the coast. Now, how do you boost value of the array? Is a 12-year payback for most of America the best you can do? The answer is no, not at all. If you want to do more design planning, you can go into time of day metering rate structures where you have a peak rate in the middle of the day and an off-peak rate at night. And often this kind of rate structuring can improve the payback of your array by over 10%. And on top of that, the homeowner at that time becomes a little bit more cognizant of their rate structures and can do some low-hanging load shifting as well to push those savings even further. So there is some rate structure flexibility. You'd have to go to your utility website and research your local rate structures. And then there's solar design software that can help you economically appraise it, or you can model it in Excel on your own, which is perfectly fine too. In terms of policy, one of the more important policies to figure out before heading into the process is what you are compensated for power that's exported onto the grid. So even if at the end of the month, so this is day 1, this is day 2, this is day 3, maybe on day 4 you consume a whole bunch of power, or maybe at night you're consuming a bunch of power, and maybe at the end of the month you've consumed more power than what you've pushed onto the grid. In some states, what you've pushed onto the grid gets credited at retail price. So your new bill is simply your consumption minus your surplus production. So some of your production is being realized through simply diminished consumption. I got a call from a client who said, JR, I'm actually kind of upset because I'm looking at my utility bill and what they're crediting on my bill for solar production is about 1/4 of what you said it would be. And the reason was the customer wasn't looking at their online monitoring system telling them their total system production. They were just looking at what the utility was buying back. And that was about 1/4 of their total amount at the end of that period. And actually, when they called me, it was right around February. And what had happened was they got so used to not paying an electric bill in June, July, August, September. And then in the wintertime, their arrays covered up with snow, but they actually, instead of having a month-to-month plan where you settle up at the end of the month, they have a unlimited plan, where any surplus credits get rolled over indefinitely. And so what happened is they had surplus credits from the summer roll over into the fall, and surplus credits from the fall roll over into the winter. But in the winter time in Eau Claire, they don't generate as much as what they need, so they start dipping into their surplus. And then all of a sudden you get to the end of winter and they're out of surplus credits, and all of a sudden they get an electric bill, and that's when they look up and they say, you know, that's when we ran into that issue. Oh, no problem. That's what the online monitoring is for. Most states have annual net metering, where you don't have unlimited rollover, but it's a little bit better than month-to-month rollover. Solar arrays are going to export more power in the fall and in the spring. In the summer, you're going to produce more energy, but you're also going to burn more energy with your air conditioning. In the fall and the spring, you have a combination of cooler weather, better sun angles for a 412 roof pitch, and you're not using either electric heating or electric air conditioning. So it's often in the fall and in the springtime that you're producing surplus credit. And actually, you have to look out for these annual plans, because you would think the reconciliation would be occurring at the end of the year. But often they'll do the reconciliation, you know, pretty much at the end of spring, because any surplus accumulated by fall that carries through winter, if you make it all the way into spring, you're going to start accumulating surplus credits anymore. So rather than carry those surplus into summer, utilities will set their annual recreation date at the end of spring, and thus the economics, you know, you never get to use those surplus credits. And so the economics appear more like month to month. All of that is okay. The worst part is when a utility provides zero net metering. And, you know, what's funny about this is zero net metering is what occurs in most of the world. And what it means is that the instant you push onto the grid, so no longer do you pull and push and then just subtract out what you push from what you pulled. You know, now it's regardless of how much you bring onto site, the instant you output power onto the grid, you only get what's called avoided cost, which is the same price that a manufacturer would get if they're running a diesel generator on site and pushing diesel electricity back into the grid. They get avoided cost for that, and solar gets the same thing. So I do think that solar generators providing distributed refined energy at the distribution level, and that it's clean, deserve something a little bit more than no net metering. You know, maybe unlimited net metering is overkill because the utility does have to profit. I really like month-to-month reconciliation because that allows you to export during the day and import at night. But if you want to completely knock out your electric bill, you have to do some surplus production to sell back to the utility at a rate that they can make profit off of. So if you want to stop paying the utility money, you have to cut the utility in a little bit on a month-to-month reconciliation plan. In other words, the utility will make a little bit of profit off of solar customer under a monthly net metering platform. But where most of this policy is going is net metering is getting scrapped, and it's being replaced with what's called a value of solar tariff, which is a little bit above avoided cost. And usually it can be above the price of electricity like it is in Minnesota, but usually it's set maybe at 70% the retail value of electricity, so that, you know, it's not a full retail exchange, but it only applies to, you know, whatever you export. So it's not as big of a deal if you do a little bit of energy management on site. We're going to talk more about that tomorrow. But anyway, you need to know your net metering policy. And if you're in one of the locations that has zero net metering at all, that's the worst part of the country to do solar in. And that's like Mississippi. I came out here because there were some good utility scale incentives. I've worked on some utility scale projects, but right now there's no net metering and the residential market is essentially non-existent. The only market in Mississippi that there is off-grid, which is fun because you get to do expensive new systems that have a lot of design work in them, but it's not a mainstream market. Now, the last thing I have to say on net metering is that if you go into deregulated electric markets like Texas, where there's no state law for net metering in Texas, which is very ironic because the mandate from the federal government, it's kind of like the Paris Climate Agreement. It's a mandate, but there's no teeth attached to not abiding by it. There's a federal mandate that every state has its own net metering policy, but there's no penalty for avoiding it because the feds don't want to directly regulate the price of electricity at the state level. It's not something they have authority to do, so they've stayed out of it for the most part. But in the states like Texas, where you have no state mandated net metering, you still have vendors of electricity, your retail electric providers, offering some form of net metering that is more like a value of solar tariff than true net metering, but it's much better than avoided cost purchasing from their customers voluntarily. And then on the other hand, you have regulated utilities where there's no customer choice over how you buy your electricity, and it befuddles me that some of the only regulated utilities that have a monopoly over their entire domain, a complete monopoly on all electricity sales in their state or in their territory, a co-op is kind of similar to that. You'll get these communities that have regulated grids where you're subject to a monopoly, where you don't have any net metering policy at all because the power company calls all the shots. And so it's like, well, hold on. We're giving the power company the monopoly so that they can better streamline electricity pricing. But if you can get more consumer rights by deregulating the grid, these regulated companies that are holding out on net metering policies risk deregulation. And I think it's a little short-sighted of them to not offer net metering to their customers in some way, shape, or form. Now, what's ironic about this is it was actually the net metering requirement and the federal tax credit in its current form were all part of a major push back in 2005. The tax credit was uncapped in 2008 as part of TARP, but it was reinstated with a budget cap in 2005, and the net metering mandate came from 2005 as well. And who was the president at that time? It was George W. Bush. It was George Bush who, I don't think he directly did this. I don't think Dick Cheney was a big solar guy. But it was the Bush administration that presided over the federal net metering mandate. Of course, Texas ignored it. And it was also the Bush administration that presided over the creation of the solar tax credit. So, we've come a long way in our energy policy where, just in the last time around, we have actually W is a very solar friendly president in terms of the policies he implemented. And now we have import tariffs. Seasonal electric rates change with time. We have, so that avoided cost purchase rate actually gets higher in the summertime and lower in the winter time, and retail pricing changes as well. And so in this case, like in Mississippi, you have to look at everything. You have to look at summertime electricity, wintertime electricity, net buyback rates from the utility. You have to look at how much energy is being consumed on site versus how much energy is being pushed out into the grid. There's a little bit more of a design process than just covering up the entire roof with solar. which under a net metered situation is often what happens. But here's coming back to that debate between the north side of the rooftop and the south side of the rooftop. What we're going to look at is, here I have the south side of the building, and there's some obstacles. Now, we could reroute these plumbing vents, but let's assume we're staying 4 feet away from them, keeping them nice and serviceable, keeping the array nice and serviceable as well. What happens is, on the south side of this building, we can only fit a 4.6 kilowatt array. And then there's a tree there, but we're going to assume the tree is being chopped down for this example. The north side of the building is completely free and clear. So we can have a huge array on the north side of the building, but a small array on the south side of the building. So now we're choosing between two designs: a tiny solar array with better per watt production, or a larger solar array with worse per watt production because it's facing north instead of south. Same price of electricity, same federal tax credit. What is commonly overlooked is that you have the same design fees that go into a small array versus a slightly larger array. The time spent to get the material to site, and then the crew to site, and then the crew up on the rooftop, and they're already putting in this section, and this section, and it's really getting the sections started that takes the most amount of time. So if the crew's already on the roof, having them follow beyond and fill this other section up, that's not going to double or triple or quadruple your labor pricing. You might be able to install 4 times as much solar for only 50% more labor budget. And then your permit fees and your design and your engineering stamp, and the fact that you benefit by buying pallets of modules rather than a portion of a pallet, all of that adds up till you start getting into some economies of scale. And so the other part of the puzzle is, well, what's your installation pricing? Because if I'm looking at a south-facing solar array on more of an ideal tilt angle, if my installation price gets too high, my simple payback can actually be substantially longer than a solar design that does more total damage to your electric bill, that's installed for a cheaper unit price. Even though the array is less productive, it's not just about how much that electricity is produced, it's also about how much it's worth. The north-facing array generates at a higher rate in the summertime, so that helps to make up for the loss. And then on top of that, you get the economies of scale on your install price. And so if you produce 20% less power, but the project costs 40% less per watt, that's going to be a more cost-effective array than something that's smaller, where those fixed project costs are divided through a smaller project size. So we have a question that says, we build apartments 3 stories up with a flat roof, 50 units or so. Can we utilize solar without the solar array and the meter for each unit? And the answer is it depends. There's a few ways you can do this. Some are quasi-legal and some are legal. But the point is, for most solar savings where it's distributed, you're going to be wanting the array to be behind the meter. Because when you're behind the meter, here's your normal building power usage, and here's the solar array, and so now your new building power usage is something that's going to look like this, where it goes up in the morning, and then as the solar array turns on, now we get into an export situation, and then it goes back up at night. Whatever you need, if you want to do apartment complex with 1 solar array, you need a couple of things. One, you need a meter. Maybe it's for the whole condo or something that you can net meter against for doing 1 large array per meter. 2, we're going to show you an incentive website tomorrow where you can look up your net metering policy and see if you have virtual net metering. So like Arthur, I don't know what location you're from, but if you're in, say, New York City, like Todd is, you can actually do what's called virtual net metering, where the power company will allow you to assign multiple electric accounts to the same solar array so that you can net meter for multiple units. So maybe you take your top 20 units and you give them free electricity and charge higher rent. So we have a question that says, we build apartments 3 stories up with a flat roof, 50 units or so. Can we utilize solar without the solar array and the meter for each unit? And the answer is it depends. There's a few ways you can do this. Some are quasi-legal and some are legal. But the point is, for most solar savings where it's distributed, you're going to be wanting the array to be behind the meter. Because when you're behind the meter, you know, here's your normal building power usage and here's the solar array. And so now your new building power usage is something that's going to look like this, where it goes up in the morning, and then as the solar array turns on, now we get into an export situation, and then it goes back up at night. You know, whatever you need, if you want to do apartment complex with one solar array, you need a couple of things. One, you need a meter. Maybe it's for the whole condo or something that you can net meter against for doing one large array per meter. Two, we're going to show you an incentive website tomorrow where you can look up your net metering policy and see if you have virtual net metering. So like Arthur, I don't know what location you're from, but if you're in, say, New York City, like Todd is, you can actually do what's called virtual net metering, where the power company will allow you to assign multiple electric accounts to the same solar array so that you can net meter for multiple units. So maybe you take your top 20 units and you give them free electricity and charge higher rent. On the subject of commercial solar development, a very common mistake that I see is you get solar installers from the residential market moving into commercial for the very first time. And for residential, we calculate payback by taking the installed price, subtracting out any upfront local incentives or federal incentives like the tax credit, then dividing by your production and dividing by the generation rate of the array. And the thing about when I personally buy a solar array and put it on my roof, I don't claim depreciation like I would if I'm a business. But also, if I save $100 off my electric bill, I don't report $100 of income to the IRS and pay taxes on it. Commercial buildings, you'll see solar installers say, well, you get the tax credit and you get depreciation. So commercial arrays get twice the incentives because, you know, often you can fully depreciate the array with equipment incentives that are not specific to solar. I mean, shoot, it used to be that you could fully depreciate up to like 500 kilowatts of an array between the Section 79 depreciation and the bonus depreciation. And back in the day, you could amend past year's tax credits as a corporation and retroactively apply the tax credit against past years. And that was a very easy time to sell a solar array, to say the least. But the problem is, many solar installers, when presenting commercial solar economics, is they'll present the cash flow savings, they'll present the depreciation savings, but they won't present the fact that if I save $100 off my electric bill as a business, I am now $100 more profitable, and I have to pay income tax on that $100. And so really depreciation isn't an incentive. It kind of offsets the income tax value. And so if you're in a market where you see a commercial array being pitched as a better payback than a residential array, it better be a battery array. Otherwise, the installer doesn't, they're not modeling the tax effect of, you have to either do a pre-tax payback calculation where you do not calculate the depreciation and you do not calculate the income tax effect. Or what's more proper for commercial is you do a full post-tax analysis. There are softwares out there to help you do that. Energy Toolbase is a great one where you can actually model demand savings into it too. And Energy Toolbase will make cash flow diagrams that are so good it'll make your CFO smile. I used to have to do all this stuff in Microsoft Excel, modeling it by hand. There's the human error element, and now software takes it over. Energy Toolbase in particular, it's tied into PV watts. It's tied into your local utility databases. So it's like you put in your array size, you put in your building load data that you can get from your electrical account and select your utility, and boom, you got your project financials.